So now we can finally talk about what have we done so far. Let's just do a very quick summary. That's a lot. Okay, so we introduced nominal and real interest rate, and from there we, where is the equation? We first derived this equation, and from there we introduced inflation into it. Instead of just looking at the price level, we just introduced inflation, and from there we derived this. This is sometimes called the Fisher equation. It's not mentioned in the book, but I've heard it being called Fisher equation after the economist Eugene Fisher. So this is a very important relationship for us, which effectively tells us that the real interest rate is equal to, very close to, not exactly equal to, but very close to nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, the expected inflation rate. Did some numerical calculations around here. Okay. And then we talked about the ith relation. And what I tried to explain to you guys is that even though the government or the central bank will control the nominal interest rate, they will do that with an aim of reaching a certain level of real interest rate, which is really what they are after. They don't really care about what the nominal interest rate is. That doesn't matter. It's the real interest rate that they're trying to adjust. And I gave you guys a numerical example to explain that. We talked about the liquidity trap after that, and I showed you how in times like with different levels of inflation and deflation, the liquidity trap problem may become exaggerated, exacerbated. That was here. And then we introduced risk, and how I showed you guys that as risk goes up, we are going to demand a higher and higher interest rate to buy those bonds. And so we finally introduced the fact that there will be different levels of interest rate in the economy. So now the final part of this chapter, we are finally going to take a look at the ICE-LM framework. ICE-LM model with different levels of interest rate. Because notice what we had in chapter 5. In chapter 5, the ICE equation was y equals to consumption, y minus t plus I, which was y and I plus g. From here, we effectively endogenized investment. And for LM, we effectively had the interest rate, which was set by the government, and it did not change. This is what we had. But now it should become obvious to you guys after this chapter is that the interest rate that's going into ICE and the interest rate that's going into LM are not the same thing. They're different things, and we have to account for that. Okay. So what I'm going to write down now is the more advanced version of ICE and LM equation. Okay. So for ICE, I'm going to write y equals to c y minus t plus I, y, that doesn't change. And here I'm going to write r plus x plus g. And for LM, I'm going to write, what am I going to write? R equals to, so two changes. First of all, instead of I, I'm writing R. We don't really care about I. What the central bank is trying to do is arrive at real interest rate. And even as regular customers, we don't really care about the nominal interest rate. Suppose the bank says we're going to pay you 20% interest. That sounds high. But if we know that inflation next year is going to be 50%, we no longer think that the 20% interest rate is attractive. So we don't really care about nominal interest rate. we are worried about R. So that's why instead of I have included, what am I doing? So that's why instead of I've included R in both these cases. The other difference is that I have added an X here. Okay, so what does that mean? So what we are going to do is this R, we are going to call this the policy rate, because this is the interest rate that's set by, let me write this down, set by central bank, and it depends on the monetary policy that the government is pursuing, whether they want expansionary or contractionary policy or something like that. So this is based on policy. So that's why the R bar, what we have here, is called the policy rate. And the R plus X that we have, we've already talked about what these are. X is the risk premium and R is the real interest rate. This is known as the borrowing rate. Because this is the rate at which customers and firms will borrow. Okay, so this is the rate that's available to us, people such as you and me and other companies that wants to take loans. They face the borrowing rate because they take loans from a variety of different financial institutions, companies, banks, and they all have some risk associated with them, which is captured here by X, the risk premium, and R bar is the policy rate, which is set by the government. Okay. So now that we have this, if we were to draw the ISLM, what will that look like? So we have Y here, we have R here. So suppose this is what the IS looks like. This is the LM that we have. Okay. And is there anything new here? The new thing is that IS, when we looked at chapter 5, IS curve would shift if there were changes in Y or if there were changes in I. But now IS will also shift if there are changes in X. So for whatever reason, the risk of borrowing in the economy goes up. Okay, X, suppose X goes up. And so what's going to happen in that case? Is that IS curve shifts. So that's the only difference really, is that we're not including the risk premium in our model previously in chapter 5, but in this chapter we are going to do it. Okay, so that's it. So what's the takeaway from this chapter? This is where I want to focus on. What's the takeaway from this chapter? How does this chapter pushes the debate forward from what we had in chapter 5? So there are a few things that we would need to know about. One is that what we learned is that these two are not the same thing. Okay, so there is a nominal interest rate, there is a real interest rate, and to know the difference between these two is very different. It's very important because both the government and companies and people, we care about the real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate. And to calculate the real interest rate, we have to bring inflation into the mix. We had not talked about inflation until chapter 8, and that's why after chapter 5, after chapter 5, I skipped chapter 6 and went to then did chapter 7, 8, 9, 10 because we had not talked about inflation. But now that we know what inflation is after chapter 8 and 9, we can come and talk about how there is a difference between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate, and the differences are important to know about. Once we learned this, from here we figured out this equation, R equals to I minus expected inflation. And this shows us that the liquidity trap is actually a bit more complicating than we had seen in chapter 5. There are more numerous cases in which liquidity trap may become a problem. In chapter 5, we only thought that the main problem was that nominal interest rate could not go below 0%, and that was the main problem, which is of course still a problem. But what we're also seeing in this chapter is that it's not just that nominal interest rate cannot go below 0%, but it's also the different levels of inflation that actually tells us what the boundaries of real interest rate is going to be. Because what we know is that, of course, this can go as low as 0, which means that the lowest that the real interest rate can go is the negative of our inflation. And so this is a stronger relationship than what we had seen previously. This is the first takeaway from this chapter. The second takeaway is the risk premium. So we had assumed in chapter 5 that there are no risks, and when you borrow from someone, they're going to pay you back. But that's not always the case, and there is always a risk premium. And so what we have seen is that as X is going up, which is the risk premium, the interest that we demand, I or R, it's the same argument either way, I or R would also be going up. If I'm taking higher risk, I'm going to have to be compensated by a higher interest rate, higher return, higher profit, whatever you would call it. So this is another important takeaway. And the final takeaway is that we determined that the interest rate that goes into IS and the interest rate that goes into LM are not the same thing. And so in IS curve, we follow X plus R, which is the rate that is faced by borrowers. That's why it's called the borrowing rate. And in the LM, what we follow is the rate that is just set by the government. So that is known as the policy rate. So these are the three important takeaways for this chapter. And I don't think it's really that complicating if you guys read the book as well. I mean, we've done far more complicating chapters in this course already. So this really shouldn't be a very difficult chapter.